Frank Lucas didn't take Harlem by force. He took it by making everyone else unnecessary. In a neighborhood where power usually arrived with gunfire and shouted names, Frank Lucas moved quietly. No speeches, no public threats, no need to announce himself. By the time people realized Harlem streets had changed, the change was already permanent. Ownership didn't look like control back then, it looked like fear. Whoever caused the most violence ruled the longest, at least for a while. Bodies marked territory. Reputation enforced borders. That was the old rule. Frank Lucas ignored it. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you love true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Harlem in the late 1960s was chaotic but predictable. Street crews fought over corners. The mafia controlled supply. Everyone paid someone above them, and violence settled disagreements below. It was loud, it was inefficient, and it burned through leaders fast. Lucas watched all of it and learned what not to do. He noticed something others didn't. The streets weren't owned by the men with guns. They were owned by the men who decided what moved through them. Supply mattered more than territory. Stability mattered more than fear. So Lucas aimed higher than corners. He aimed beneath them. While other gangsters focused on visibility, Lucas focused on flow. Who brought the product in? Who distributed it? Who kept things running when arrests happened? He didn't want to fight over Harlem. He wanted Harlem to depend on him. That difference changed everything. Frank Lucas didn't look like a boss. He didn't dress like one. He didn't surround himself with armed men. He blended in so well that people underestimated him by default. That invisibility became his first layer of protection. He built it quietly, carefully. No sudden expansion, no reckless moves. Each step was tested before the next one followed. Harlem didn't feel conquered, it felt stabilized. Corners tied to Lucas didn't erupt in violence. Supply didn't disappear overnight. Prices didn't swing wildly. Arrests didn't trigger chaos. The streets became calmer, and calm is dangerous because it attracts loyalty. Dealers noticed first. Working under Lucas meant predictability. No sudden shortages, no surprise retaliation, no emotional decisions. Business felt boring, and boring was profitable. Violence dropped not because Lucas cared about peace, but because chaos disrupted flow. The streets adjusted around that order. People stopped asking who controlled Harlem. They started asking who supplied it, and the answer kept coming back the same way, quietly and consistently. Frank Lucas. Law enforcement didn't notice at first. They were trained to chase noise. Harlem had plenty of it elsewhere. Lucas's operation didn't fit the profile. No public boss, no visible hierarchy, no trail of bodies leading upward. Ownership without spectacle confused everyone. Lucas understood that fear creates resistance, but stability creates dependence. Once Harlem depended on his system, ownership became automatic. No announcements required, no wars necessary. By the time rivals realized what had happened, Harlem wasn't up for grabs anymore. It was already spoken for, not by force, but by function. Frank Lucas didn't claim Harlem streets. He made them work for him. And once that happened, the streets answered to only one man. Violence had always been the language of the streets. Frank Lucas chose not to speak about it. In Harlem, power usually announced itself through gunshots and funerals. The man who ruled was the man people feared most. Fear kept people in line, at least until someone louder came along. That cycle had ruled the streets for decades. Lucas saw the flaw in it. Fear was unstable. It needed constant reinforcement. Miss one payment, show weakness once, lose control for a moment. Fear disappeared, and so did power. Worse, violence brought attention, and attention brought police. Lucas wanted something stronger than fear. He wanted a routine. He built power the way institutions do, not with intimidation but with consistency. Everyone connected to his operation knew exactly how things worked. The rules didn't change. Decisions weren't emotional. Payments arrived on time. The product stayed the same. That predictability created discipline. People didn't stay with Lucas because they were scared of him. They stayed because leaving meant chaos. Chaos meant lost money, unpredictable supply, and danger. Working with Lucas felt safe in a world that rarely was. That safety rewrote the meaning of control. Corners under Lucas's influence became calmer. Turf wars faded. Disputes were handled quietly. Violence wasn't eliminated. It was discouraged because it disrupted the system. Anyone who brought unnecessary attention was removed without spectacle. No warnings. No public punishment. Just absence. That silence sent a clearer message than fear ever could. Lucas also controlled visibility. He didn't want to be known. He avoided flashy spending and public recognition. He dressed plainly, moved quietly, and let others remain visible while he stayed in the background. Power didn't need a face. Law enforcement struggled to identify leadership. Arrests didn't destabilize operations. Removing individuals didn't expose hierarchy. The streets kept moving, and that movement hid the hand guiding it. Lucas had turned Harlem into a machine. This approach changed how people thought about crime. Violence was no longer a requirement for authority. Reputation mattered less than reliability. Whoever could keep things running on the streets, not through terror but through function. Rivals tried to provoke conflict. Lucas refused to respond. No retaliation, no escalation. Without reaction, provocation lost purpose. The absence of response became dominance. Harlem adjusted to this new rule quietly. People stopped measuring power by who carried the biggest gun. They measured it by who controlled supply and stability. And that control belonged to Frank Lucas. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. The streets didn't fear him. They depended on him. And dependence is the strongest form of ownership there is. Before Frank Lucas, Harlem answered to tradition. Not law's tradition. The mafia controlled the supply lines. Street crews controlled corners. Everyone knew where they stood. Power passed down through reputation, fear, and inheritance. You didn't question the order. You worked within it or you suffered. Lucas saw that structure as outdated. Too many hands demanded payment simply because they always had. Too many decisions were made emotionally. Too much power relied on memory instead of performance. Tradition kept the streets loud and unstable. Frank Lucas didn't challenge the old kings. He made them unnecessary. Instead of fighting over territory, Lucas targeted the supply itself. By bypassing established wholesalers and going straight to the source, he eliminated the need for mafia permission. That move alone rewired Harlem's criminal economy. Suddenly, the most important question wasn't who controlled the corner. It was who controlled the product. Lucas did. By controlling supply, he controlled everything beneath it. Price, purity, timing. Dealers no longer depended on legacy power. They depended on reliability, and Lucas delivered consistently. There was no announcement of this shift, no declaration of independence. The mafia didn't receive a challenge, they received silence. Orders slowed, calls stopped. Loyalty drifted away without confrontation. By the time they noticed, there was nothing to fight. Lucas had no public headquarters, no visible hierarchy, no figurehead demanding tribute. His power didn't stand in the street, it moved beneath it. The old kings relied on fear to maintain dominance. Lucas relied on economics, lower prices, better quality, fewer disruptions. Violence became expensive, not useful. Street crews adapted quickly. Working under Lucas meant less instability, fewer wars, more money. Tradition lost to logic. The mafia still existed, but their role diminished. They weren't defeated in battle, they were bypassed in practice. Their influence faded as Harlem adjusted to a system that didn't need them. This shift rewrote another rule. Power didn't belong to the loudest voice or the oldest name. It belonged to whoever made themselves essential. Frank Lucas became essential. Ownership of Harlem didn't come through intimidation or legacy. It came through function. The streets didn't bow because Lucas demanded it. They adjusted because his system worked better. And once the streets adjusted, the old kings had nowhere left to stand. Frank Lucas built his control on silence. Eventually, that silence drew attention. Law enforcement was trained to respond to chaos. Gunshots, turf wars, informants scrambling for deals. Harlem had always provided plenty of that, just not where Lucas operated. His corners stayed calm. Arrests didn't disrupt supply. Violence didn't surge when key players disappeared. That calm stood out. Investigators began noticing patterns that didn't fit street crime. The same product surfaced across multiple neighborhoods. The packaging looked identical. Purity stayed consistent. Prices didn't fluctuate the way they should have. This wasn't luck. It was coordination. Police stopped looking for a loud boss and started studying logistics. They followed repetition instead of reputation. Money moved too cleanly. Distribution routes repeated with precision. Even when individuals were removed, the system adjusted without panic. Frank Lucas sensed the shift before warrants appeared. He didn't react emotionally. He refined the operation. Routes changed. Couriers rotated. Communication narrowed. Fewer people knew more than their single role. The streets kept moving, but more carefully. Still, no system remains flawless forever. As profits grew, discipline weakened. Some members grew careless. Others wanted recognition. Comfort replaced caution. The rules that once protected the operation began to feel restrictive. Corruption added another layer of risk. Bribes provided early warnings and delayed pressure, but they also created dependency. The more the system relied on compromised outsiders, the more fragile it became. Investigators noticed that too. Instead of rushing, they waited. They collected fragments. Small arrests, minor inconsistencies, financial trails that didn't match street-level behavior. Individually, none of it mattered. Together, it formed a map. Efficiency became the giveaway. The very traits that allowed Frank Lucas to own Harlem streets, discipline, consistency, silence, now marked his operation as something extraordinary. And extraordinary operations attract attention no matter how quiet they try to be. On the streets, the mood shifted. Movement slowed, trust thinned. Silence felt heavier. It no longer meant safety, it meant scrutiny. Frank Lucas had turned Harlem into a machine. Now that machine was being studied. And once order becomes suspicious, it can no longer hide. Frank Lucas did not lose Harlem in a gunfight. He lost it in silence. The takedown didn't come with sirens screaming through the neighborhood or headlines announcing the end of an era. It came with preparation. Surveillance files were finalized. Warrants were coordinated. Arrests were timed to avoid disruption. When Lucas was taken into custody, Harlem didn't erupt. It hesitated. That hesitation revealed how much of the streets had depended on him. The system Lucas built had been designed to survive arrests, but it had never been designed to operate without him. He wasn't just a supplier or a boss. He was the mind that balanced risk, adjusted routes, and corrected mistakes before they became disasters. Without him, uncertainty spread. Couriers waited instead of moving. Distributors slowed their orders. Money stopped flowing with its usual precision. Silence, once a shield, turned into doubt. No one knew which rule still applied. The streets felt it almost immediately. Corners grew tense. Supply became inconsistent, prices shifted unpredictably. Without centralized discipline, small disputes escalated. Violence crept back in not as a strategy but as a reaction to instability. In court, Lucas faced a world that didn't care about his system. Discipline meant nothing there. Silence offered no protection. Evidence replaced efficiency. Lucas understood that reality quickly. He didn't posture. He didn't deny what was happening. He calculated. Cooperation became leverage. Lucas chose to talk, not out of regret but strategy. His testimony exposed corruption that had quietly insulated his operation for years. Officers, intermediaries, and institutional failures were pulled into the open. That exposure shattered more than his empire. The underworld lost its sense of security. Protection that once seemed permanent was revealed as conditional. Loyalty fractured. Silence lost its value. Harlem didn't immediately belong to someone else. It fractured instead. Competing crews rushed to fill the vacuum. Without structure, chaos returned unevenly and violently. The streets didn't miss Frank Lucas. They missed orders. His collapse proved something fundamental. Fear had never owned Harlem. Structure had. And once that structure disappeared, the streets reverted to the instability they had briefly escaped. Frank Lucas had owned Harlem streets without violence. Losing him proved just how much control he truly had. Frank Lucas did not leave Harlem as a conqueror. He left as an absence. When his control disappeared, the streets didn't return to balance. They fractured. Competing crews fought to fill the space where structure once existed. Violence returned unevenly, not because it was wanted, but because it rushed in to replace order. For a time, Harlem had functioned differently. Corners were quieter. Supply was consistent. Disputes were managed instead of escalating. That period didn't feel like peace, but it felt stable. And stability is noticeable only when it's gone. Frank Lucas had owned Harlem streets without ever claiming them publicly. His ownership didn't rely on fear, tradition, or spectacle. It relied on function. He controlled what moved through the streets, and by controlling movement, he controlled behavior. After his fall, others tried to copy his model. Some adopted tighter logistics. Others reduced visibility. Most failed. They wanted the results without the discipline. They copied efficiency but ignored restraint. Law enforcement changed as well. The quiet era Lucas represented forced a shift in strategy. Investigators learned to follow patterns, money, and repetition instead of waiting for chaos to reveal leadership. Silence was no longer assumed to mean safety. In that sense, Lucas changed both sides of the street. His legacy remains uncomfortable. Some view him as a strategist who applied logic to a violent environment. Others see the harm that follows: addiction, dependency, communities shaped around a single product. Both views are true. Frank Lucas was not powerful because he was violent. He was powerful because he was patient. He understood that real ownership doesn't announce itself. It normalizes itself. When control feels routine, resistance fades. When order becomes expected, authority becomes invisible. The streets answered to Frank Lucas, not because he demanded obedience, but because his system made obedience logical. And once the streets learned that rule, they never fully forgot it. Frank Lucas owned Harlem streets quietly. That quiet ownership may be the most dangerous kind there is.